Wanna hear all the stupid ways people have moved on to the afterlife? Well, you're in good hands. Welcome to Amazing Stupid Deaths. I am Papa Potatis. On this podcast, we go through the unfortunate, amazing, and macabre deaths that have been saved for posterity on darwinawards.com. Today we are going through the last 9 of these 1994 cautionary tales. So keep your ears perked, cause the list gets progressively juicier. Let's go, tots. Absolutely radiant. Confirmed true by Darwin. 10th of December 1968, Russia. While reading about nuclear accidents, a physicist found this Darwin Award. Mayak is a nuclear fuel processing center in central Russia that was experimenting with plutonium purification techniques. The report states that they were using an unfavorable geometry vessel in an improvised operation as a temporary vessel for storing plutonium organic solution. In other words, they were pouring liquid plutonium into unsafe equipment. It's assumed that they were cleaning a tank. So it was noticed that the solution was a combination of organic and aqueous gunk in the tank. 2 operators, instructed by the shift supervisor, used an improvised setup to decant the dark brown organic solution that was concentrated plutonium. The shift supervisor then left to tend to other duties. During the second filling of the bottle, a mixture of aqueous and organic solution was drawn in. As a result, the operators stopped filling the bottle. One asked the shift supervisor for further instructions. He was told to continue decanting the solution. This operator poured it into a 60-liter vessel for a second time. After most of the solution had been poured out, the operator saw a flash of light and felt a pulse of heat. Startled, the operator dropped the bottle, ran down the stairs and from the room. The plutonium was too concentrated and he had accidentally started a nuclear chain reaction. The alarms sounded and everyone evacuated. So far, no fatal errors. But a second criticality happens while everyone is safely underground. Here's where it gets good. The shift supervisor insisted that the radiation control supervisor permit him to enter the work area. The radiation control supervisor resisted, but finally accompanied the shift supervisor back into the building. As they approached the basement room where the accident had occurred, the radiation levels continued to rise. The radiation control supervisor prohibited the shift supervisor from proceeding. In spite of the prohibition, the shift supervisor deceived the radiation control supervisor and entered the room full of plutonium. His subsequent actions were not observed by anyone. However, there was evidence that he attempted to pour the plutonium into a floor drain. His actions caused a third excursion, larger than the first 2, activating the alarm system in both buildings. The shift supervisor proceeded to set off an even bigger nuclear chain reaction. The shift supervisor, covered in plutonium organic solution, immediately returned to the underground tunnel. He died about 1 month after the accident, having received 4 times the fatal dose of radiation. Everyone else survived. So even if the shift supervisor had lived, he would still qualify for a Darwin Award, because that much radiation causes sterility. Whew. I get the creeps from radiation stories. Like radiation in general feels so volatile and mysterious. It's like it can't be controlled. In the beginning, there was a line that stuck with me. They said, an unfavorable geometry vessel in an improvised operation as a temporary vessel for storing plutonium organic solution. And it got me thinking, What do they mean by unfavorable geometry vessel? Isn't it only the material of a container that determines whether it's safe or not? So I did a little bit of research and I learned that the shape of a container matters too. How plutonium is arranged in their container, it matters a lot. If it's poured in the wrong shaped container, then when the plutonium splits, neutrons hit other plutonium atoms, and instead of them escaping harmlessly, it can trigger self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction, also known as a criticality event. So that's why nuclear facilities use specially designed containers with special shapes that make it much harder for a chain reaction to happen. So in nuclear safety, the containers need to be wide, shallow, and have a narrow diameter. A wrong container can be just as dangerous as the wrong amount of plutonium. Now, before we drop into story number 2, which as always is even crazier, a quick reminder for all tots listening. If you want more of this, make sure to check out Papa Potatis Reacts on YouTube and Spotify, where I drop episodes bi-weekly. And if you want to catch me playing games live, come hang out at Papa Potatis on Twitch or YouTube, where I stream every week. Let's get on to the next story. Bottom of the barrel. Confirmed true by Darwin. 11th of July 1920, Niagara Falls. To support his wife and 11 children, Charles Stevens, 58-year-old demon barber of Bristol, needed more money than he could make, giving shaves and haircuts. Even his sideline as a daredevil performing high dives and parachute jumps in England barely helped cover the bills. He needed something big, something to make his reputation. There was nothing bigger and more daredevilish than going over Niagara Falls in a barrel. Only 2 people had ever done it and lived. It didn't matter that one, Annie Taylor, was living in abject poverty, or that the other, Bobby Leach, was trying to talk him out of using his heavy Russian oak barrel without first sending it on a test run. Leach's friend, William Red Hill, a daredevil whose sideline was rescuing people from Niagara's treacherous waters, also tried to dissuade Charles. But Charles believed that if he strapped his arms to the side of the barrel and his feet to a large anvil as ballast, he would pop out of the foam at the bottom of the cataract, safe and right side up. He knew what he was doing, and he was going to do it. He launched his ungainly craft early one morning and floated minutes through the rapids toward Horseshoe Falls on the Canadian side. 45 minutes after launch, the heavy barrel flew over the brink of the falls. But when Charles hit the water below, the anvil plunged through the bottom of the barrel, carrying most of Charles to the bottom with it. The barrel became stuck behind the falls. It wasn't until much later that the barrel's battered remains floated out from the mist. Attached was Charles' right arm, still strapped down inside the barrel, with his tattoo visible. "Don't forget me, Annie." Ooh, okay, that was very macabre. What a story. Some of these things that interested me made me dug out some info on the physics of falling into water from high heights and why water gets harder the higher up you are. Water is an incompressible fluid, which means that its molecules have to physically move out of the way for an object to pass through. At slow speeds, water shifts effortlessly. But when an object drops at an extreme velocity, the water doesn't have enough time to displace. Because the liquid can't compress, squeeze itself together, or move aside fast enough, the fluid's inertia generates a massive upward reaction force, making the water act like solid concrete. Well then, how aren't professional divers completely beaten up then? Well, from just 80 feet, like 25 meters, athletes must enter the water completely vertical, piercing the surface like a needle. A belly flop from 80 feet, 25 meters height, can tear internal organs or shatter bones because of the surface area slamming into the water all at once. Charles, in this story, did not enter the water like a needle. He made things worse for himself with his heavy, wide, flat-bottomed oak barrel that doesn't break the water tension like a needle. The moment it hit the plunge pool, the water didn't cushion his fall. It struck the base of the craft with 1,000 pounds of instantaneous force, and that made the barrel more into a grenade, and the anvil added force to it. And this is how the softest, most life-giving element in nature hits like a brick wall with enough force. Let's go to the next story. Tired ammo. Unconfirmed by Darwin. 1990s, United States. I heard the following at work in the gun shop. The events described below, if it's not a legend, occurred in the 1990s in the Southwest. A small-time hoodlum, about to be even smaller, broke into the home of a World War II veteran and stole, among other things, the old GI's 45 caliber automatic pistol, which he used in battle in the 1940s. The hoodlum then reported directly to a local convenience store and proceeded to rob the cashier while brandishing his new pistol. The cashier, no dummy, followed orders and handed over the contents of the register. Our thug took the money and turned to leave, but suddenly decided he didn't want to leave a witness, other than the security camera, that is. He leveled the pistol at the cashier and pulled the trigger. Click went the gun. At this unexpected development, the puzzled crook looked straight down the barrel of his weapon and uttered the words, "What the?" As it turned out, the World War II veteran had World War II vintage ammunition in his World War II vintage pistol. Priming caps over time are known to lose their spontaneous nature, particularly if stored improperly, causing what is known as a hang fire. The primer smolders and turns into a delayed ignition, such as was the case here. Just as the puzzled crook had the barrel pointed squarely at his own eye, the hang-fired primer detonated, sending a half-inch chunk of lead and associated hot combustion gases directly into the felon's skull at 900 feet per second. The range was less than 6 inches, and the body could only be identified by fingerprints. As the story was related to me, the police officer who responded to the original gun burglary was also at the scene of the armed robbery. He picked up the 45 and verified the serial number, then returned it to the World War II veteran. Case closed. Okay, that was brutally chaotic, I must say. It's almost like it's taken from a cartoon. I was fascinated by this hang fire phenomenon that made the gun act like it had a dynamite fuse. So I checked up on the science behind it. Inside every bullet's primer cap, there is a shock-sensitive explosive compound designed to detonate instantly when struck by a firing pin. In a fresh round, that chemical reaction generates a supersonic shockwave, igniting the main gunpowder in under a single millisecond. So why did this World War II bullet take a pause? Well, over 50 years, atmospheric moisture and chemical oxidation had slowly broken down the delicate explosive compounds. So instead of triggering a violent instant shockwave, the degraded chemical mix begins to smolder quietly at a microscopic level. slowly burning through the damp compound until it finally builds up enough heat to trigger the main powder charge. Our thief assumed the click meant it didn't work at all, and that it was a harmless mechanical dud. All the while, unbeknownst to our hoodlum, the chemical fuse was actively burning just inches from his eye. Firearm deaths like this almost always involve inexperience. Honestly, I'm happy to live in Sweden where guns are much less in circulation, even though we ironically export a majority of them out in the world. So thoughts, when dealing with all dangerous things, take your time and stay safe. A sudden silence doesn't mean the gun failed. It could just mean that the countdown has started. Let's move to the next story. Mortal insult. Confirmed true by Darwin. 1992, California. Snakes flick their forked tongues in the air to smell the world, collecting molecules and analyzing them by pressing their tongue tips into small olfactory pits. And tit for tat, inebriated 20-year-old man, apparently unaware of this biological fact, took umbrage when a wild rattlesnake stuck out its tongue at him. He pulled up the rattler in front of his face and stuck his tongue out right back at him. The snake expressed its displeasure at this turn of events by biting the conveniently offered body part. The toxic venom swelled the man's face and throat and tongue, of course, choking him to death. Whew. Okay, if that wasn't stupid, I don't know what is. Who, drunk and being like, oh, he's sticking out his tongue at me. Wow. Darwin Awards has some extra info on venomous snakes also that was written. Experts debate which species of venomous snake is most dangerous. It depends on how irritable the snake is, the toxicity of its venom, whether it delivers the venom reliably, and how likely the snake is to come into contact with humans. Rattlesnakes certainly rank among the most dangerous of snakes. They often live in close proximity to humans, and some species can be quite irritable, particularly when they are cornered. Rattlesnakes have long folding fangs, which deliver venom deeply into the body. However, some rattlers fail to inject venom into the bite as frequently as 25% of the time. Young rattlesnakes are more likely to deliver a full load of venom and are therefore more dangerous than their elders. For those who value their looks as much as their life, remember, rattlesnake venom is disfiguring as well as deadly. Whew. Okay, for me, I've always been afraid of the venom in snake bites, so I'm a little bit surprised that that wasn't the biggest factor here. It's actually that he died from suffocation, that everything swelled up. So this caused me to find out some more mind-titillating info about snake venom and swelling. Woohoo! When a rattlesnake strikes an arm or a leg, the venom slowly breaks down tissue, which gives a lot of time to administer antivenom. But that doesn't matter when you get bitten in critical parts of your body. The mouth is a tightly enclosed compartment with rigid jawbones and dense muscle, and your tongue is one of the most blood-rich organs in your entire body. The second that venom enters the tongue, it spreads quickly and triggers immediate massive inflammation. Because your jawbone isn't going to expand, that rapidly swelling tissue has nowhere to go but backward. It's like trying to inflate a thick leather balloon inside a narrow plastic pipe. Instead of expanding outward, the swollen tongue is forced back and down the throat, completely sealing off your airway like a cork in a bottle. This man's air supply was shut down in a matter of minutes. Whew. Honestly, this also reminds me of all the people who love putting their faces up to animals. Like, animals don't care if you are cute. They don't see you like that. They operate on a wildly different frequency that you can't even imagine. So get your face away from that face. So remember, tots, your tongue might be great at talking trash, but when you mock wild animals, they literally bite back. Okay, let's move back to the next story. So, here's multiple stories of famous people that have won Darwin Awards. Historic Darwins, confirmed true by Darwin. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I embarked on the Third Crusade to recapture the Holy Land in the 12th century. After spending days trudging across the dry summer desert, his army came upon the river Salef. In his parched state, Frederick threw caution to the wind instead of his heavy armor and plunged into the river, whereupon he sank to the bottom and drowned. Attila the Hun was one of the most notorious villains in history. He conquered all of Asia by 450 AD by destroying villages and pillaging the countryside. This bloodthirsty man died from a nosebleed on his wedding night. After feasting and toasting his own good fortune, he was too drunk to notice his nose, and he drowned in a snotful of his own blood. Tycho Brahe, a 16th century Danish astronomer whose research helped Sir Isaac Newton devise the theory of gravity, died because he didn't make it to the bathroom in time. In that society, it was considered an insult to leave the table before the banquet was over. Brahe forgot to relieve himself before the banquet began, then exasperated the matters by imbibing too much alcohol at dinner. Too polite to ask to be excused, he instead allowed his bladder to burst, which killed him slowly and painfully over the next 11 days. Francis Bacon was an influential statesman, philosopher, writer, and a scientist in the 16th century. He died while stuffing snow into a chicken. He had been struck by the notion that snow instead of salt might be used to preserve meat. To test his theory, he stood outside in the snow and attempted to stuff the bird. The chicken didn't freeze, but bacon did, prompting the question, which froze first, the bacon or the egg? Jean-Baptiste Lully, a 17th century composer who wrote music for the King of France, died from an overdose of musical enthusiasm while rehearsing for a concert. He became overexcited and drove his baton right through his foot. He succumbed to blood poisoning. Some treasured historic Darwins are not true. For instance, the legendary circumstances surrounding the death of the famous female ruler. Okay, so this is a false one. Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia in the 18th century, reputedly had a prodigious appetite for sex. Legend has it that she was killed by her bestiality practices. During one of her frequent conjugal visits with a horse, the rope sling that suspended the animal snapped, and the falling horse crushed the amorous woman. But the truth is that although Catherine had an appetite for sex, she did not indulge with her stallions. The rumor may have been started to undercut her claim to a place in history. These were really funny, a little bit of this and that all across history. These stories got me thinking about another wild death that pops back into my mind on regular occasions. The story I'm thinking about is about Tiberius Claudius Drusus, a 1st century Roman aristocrat and the eldest son of the future Emperor Claudius. He was destined for imperial power after securing a high-stakes political marriage, but his promising future was cut short by a simple piece of fruit. If you're thinking of an apple falling, you're almost on the right track. While relaxing in the city of Pompeii, the young noble decided to entertain himself by tossing a pear high in the air and catching it in his open mouth. Unfortunately, he was a little too good at catching things in his big mouth. The fruit plummeted straight down his throat, wedging firmly in his airway and suffocating him in mere moments. So in the end, this potential ruler of Rome was felled not by political intrigue or enemy's blade, but by a tragically well-aimed piece of fruit. Oh my god, history really has so many juicy stories that we, for some reason, never seem to learn from. Let's get on to the next story. Where's the chute? Where's the chute? Confirmed by Darwin. North Carolina, 1987. Ivan, an experienced parachutist with 800 jumps under his belt, was videotaping a private lesson given by an instructor for a single trainee. He had attached the video camera to his helmet so that it would capture the entire day of instruction, and the supporting power supply and recorder were in a heavy satchel slung on his back. The group went up in the plane, and the instructor led the enthusiastic beginner through preparations for the jump. Ivan carefully documented the lesson, which needed to be perfect for the sake of posterity. When they reached the jump site, Ivan jumped from the back of the plane and filmed the student and instructor jumping from the front of the plane. A few heartbeats later, tape still running, Ivan realized that he had been so focused on filming the jump that he had forgotten to strap on his own parachute. An FAA spokesperson said that the video equipment strapped to his back may have been mistaken for a parachute. In the footage salvaged from the camera and spliced together, the student and instructor are shown in free fall before they pull their ripcords and recede rapidly from view. Then the cameraman's hand reaches out for his own ripcord. That's when Ivan realizes he has no ripcord, ergo no chute. His hands are seen to flail about wildly. Then the camera pans down towards the approaching Earth. Film from the final stage of the plunge was destroyed on impact. Okay, I find it a little bit funny that, the film was destroyed, but at the same time they got to see him flail. Okay, whatever. It's said to be confirmed true, so I find that weird. Let's see if this comment from a reader gives some extra insight. Reader Signora says, "Many years ago, my two uncles started roughhousing at our Christmas gathering. Uncle Frank picked up Uncle John by the heels, lost his grip, and dropped Uncle John on his head. It was all right because John was a state Supreme Court justice and was there for life. The other uncle is, I am sure, in your archive, the one about the skydiving photographer who forgot to put on a chute." Oh, so two uncles. A reader that just says like, one of those were my uncles. Okay, sure. Whatever. This failure of checking your equipment reminds me of a story that we had about a gun instructor. It was risky reenactment, and we talked about it back in episode 3. This was about expert complacency or action slip and how it makes professionals forget the basics. And I think this is basically the same phenomenon in action. But what made Ivan's case an even deadlier trap was that he created a somatosensory illusion for himself. I'm gonna explain what a somatosensory illusion is. So when you handle things or gear up, your nervous system relies on deep pressure sensors in your skin and muscles that are called mechanoreceptors. These sensors send continuous feedback to your brain, creating an internal map that confirms that the heavy straps are pressed against your chest and shoulders. It is a subconscious feeling of everything is as it should be. So Ivan had a heavy, bulky camera battery pack striped tightly across his torso. Those pressure sensors fires off the same signals as a real parachute harness, giving his brain the tactile feedback it expects before a jump. All signals are saying go. So because his conscious mind was hyper-focused on filming the student, his mental autopilot took over and he stepped out of the plane without a care in the world. So, tater tots, remember this. Your brain loves taking lazy shortcuts. So don't be cocky in new situations. It could lead to a rapid descent. Okay, let's move on to the next story. Blotto, unconfirmed by Darwin. 7th of September 1990, Sydney, Australia. Men seem to have an affinity for large trucks. What else can explain the actions of a 34-year-old thief who decided to take possession of the engine of an old Bedford tip truck? The truck was parked outside a glass recycling company in Alexandria. It generally takes 3 men to lift an engine block of this size, but our enterprising filfer decided that the best way to remove the engine was from below, rather than the conventional out the top with a crane technique. He crawled under the cab and began to loosen the bolts. Suddenly, the engine block broke loose and landed on his face, killing him instantly. Police ascertained that he had at least one accomplice, judging by the pool of vomit found under a nearby bush. An employee discovered his body early the next morning. The manager said that the truck was about to be scrapped. If he had come and asked me for it, I would have given it to him. Readers comment that an engine block can't drop without removing the whole drivetrain and cutting out the motor mounts and bracing. Possibly it was the transmission or gearbox that fell on him, not the engine. So this is probably unconfirmed. But let's pretend that it is a real event. So I checked up how instantaneous the death was. Whatever fell on him was super heavy, if this is true. So his death was instantaneous. And it made me actually think of the modern day disaster of the Titan submersible that imploded in mere milliseconds when its hull buckled and off them all instantaneously. But how fast did it go in this truck story? Well, whether it was an engine block, the transmission, or the gearbox, it was a massive piece of iron weighing between 500 and 1,000 pounds. In the tight crawl space underneath the truck cab, it was only about 15 centimeters it had to fall, about 6 inches, before it hit his face. So the block, whatever it was, plus gravity, covers that tiny gap in roughly 180 milliseconds, which is less than 2/10 of a second. Our human nervous system needs at least 200 milliseconds just to register a flinch and tell your body to move. So this dude was completely crushed before his brain could even receive the signal that the last bolt had snapped, which also was the case in the Titan submersible. So tots, if you're gonna make fatal mistakes, at least make sure the physics delivers it as fast as it did for this dude and the Titan crew. Thinking about it, the Titan submersible story would be a great segment for a future episode. Gonna put a pin in that. Okay, let's move on to the next story. Sizzling Scaffolding, unconfirmed by Darwin. 1982, Texas. At the Amarillo Fairgrounds, some buildings were in need of a coat of paint, so local contractors were hired to do the job. Between the buildings was an angled culvert designed to drain rainwater away from the buildings. Because of the slope, the wheeled painter scaffolding tended to roll downhill, so the painters removed the wheels on the scaffolding. They were in the process of moving the scaffolding when the metal structure met a transformer. The painters were killed. That story made headlines. The town was abuzz with the talk of the tragedy and how it had come to pass, and whether the city was liable for damages. The city officials decided they needed to conduct an investigation. With much fanfare, they arrived at the scene of the incident, prepared to personally recreate the circumstances. 2 officials grabbed the scaffolding in the exact same location as the 2 painters, began to move the scaffolding, and were promptly electrocuted. Some more info here. Darwin asks, can you confirm I smell an urban legend? Mark Harrington responds with this link showing an incident involving scaffolding in 1995. He says there is no secondary electrocution of officials and adds, the entire archive of investigated electrical fatalities from 1982 to 2005 is here. And then he provides a link. So this story seems a bit bogus in the end. If this is true, why do people keep on insisting on reenacting disasters? How many more deaths are we gonna see from like copycats just trying to show how the last guy died? I don't know. It's funny. I find it very funny that they keep repeating everything. It really feels like this is just one of the classic local urban legends. But it could be true, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a story like this floating around my own little hometown. Very sad stuff, little tots, but interesting. Let's go to the last story of the day. Convince the jury. Confirmed true by Darwin. Clement Vallandigham was a well-known Northern Democrat who campaigned for states' rights during the Civil War. In 1863, Vallandigham was convicted of treason for his speeches attacking the administration of President Lincoln. He was banished to the South, where he continued to voice his political views. After the war, Vallandigham became a lawyer. In his last appearance in the courtroom, he represented a client on trial for murder. The accused man's defense was that the victim had drawn his own gun in a fashion that caused it to fire, killing himself. To prove the defense argument, Vallandigham demonstrated the victim's method of drawing a gun, using the loaded evidence gun as his prop. The firearm went off, and he lost his life, but proved his case. Okay, this getting killed in a courtroom sounds like a rare movie trope, so very dramatic, really. I thought this was really interesting, though, so I went on a bigger than usual tangent on this. So this phenomenon has affected how modern security and architecture in the law room works. So this has happened several times. Courthouses are psychological pressure cookers where you have high adrenaline, grief, vengeance, desperate defendants facing life sentences, and grieving families sitting in very close proximity to each other. When fatal incidents occur in courtrooms, there are 4 distinct categories that you could put them in. 1. Vigilante vengeance. 2. Escape attempts and disarming officers. 3. Stress-induced fatalities and extreme reactions. 4. Accidental evidence discharges. So, the first category, vigilante vengeance. Victims or families taking the law into their own hands. Before strict security checkpoints were placed at court entrances, family members could easily walk in armed to carry out extrajudicial revenge during a trial. Marianne Bachmeier, Lübeck, Germany, 1981, during the trial of the man accused of murdering her 7-year-old daughter, Bachmeister sneaked a Beretta 22 pistol into the courtroom. On the 3rd day of the trial, she drew the gun and fired 8 shots in open court, killing the defendant instantly. The Louise courtroom shooting, 1978. In a notorious case in Ruston, Louisiana, a father brought a revolver into a trial and shot the man accused of harming his child right in front of the judge and jury. Category 2. Escape attempts and disarming officers. Defendants facing long prison sentences sometimes reach a point of absolute desperation, viewing the courtroom as their final opportunity to break free before being sent to maximum security. Brian Nichols, Atlanta, Georgia, 2005. While on trial for rape at the Fulton County Courthouse, Nichols overpowered a single sheriff's deputy in a stairwell, stole her service weapon, and marched into the courtroom. He killed Judge Roland Barnes and court reporter Julianne Brando, then shot another deputy outside while escaping. This single incident forced courthouses nationwide to mandate multiple armed guards during high-risk prisoner transfers. Marin County Civic Center shootout, California, 1970. 17-year-old Jonathan Jackson walked into a courtroom, drew weapons, and armed 3 convicts who were on trial. They took Judge Harold Halley, a prosecutor, and 3 jurors hostage at gunpoint to demand the release of the Soledad brothers. During the escape attempt in a van outside, a shootout erupted, killing Judge Haley and 3 others. Category 3. Stress-induced fatalities and extreme reactions. The sheer psychological shock of a trial can trigger fatal medical events or drastic measures the second a verdict is delivered. Sudden cardiac arrest on the stand. Medical literature in forensic pathology tracks numerous cases of courtroom sudden death, where the intense rush of catecholamines, adrenaline and cortisol causes lethal cardiac arrhythmias in defendants or elderly witnesses during cross-examination. Michael Marine, Phoenix, Arizona, 2012. Right after a jury read a guilty verdict for arson that carried up to 16 years in prison, former Wall Street trader Michael Marine closed his eyes, put his hands to his face, and swallowed a cyanide capsule in open court. He collapsed seconds later and died before reaching the hospital. That was dramatic, Michael. Okay, last category. Category 4. 4. Accidental evidence discharges. The one that we read about. Before, modern evidence handling protocols required firearms to be mechanically disabled, locked, and inspected by a court bailiff before entering the room. Bringing live weapons into court created absurd hazards. Clement Vallandigham, the one we read about, the absolute pioneer of this category. His attempt to demonstrate a quick draw mechanic with a loaded prop gun remains a classic example of an accidental self-inflicted courtroom fatality. Evidence handling mishaps. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, local newspapers regularly reported incidents where loaded evidence pistols fell off tables, got snagged on evidence bags, or were mishandled by jurors, discharging rounds into courtroom floors and benches. These kind of incidents in courtrooms reshaped modern courthouses. Prior to the 1970s and 1980s, courthouses in many parts of the world were open public buildings where citizens, lawyers, and spectators could walk in without passing through metal detectors or bag checks. The accumulation of courtroom assassinations, hostage situations, and firearm accidents forced the creation of modern judicial security. That includes perimeter, X-ray, and magnetometer checks, stopping weapons at the front door rather than at the courtroom door. Cleared evidence mandates. Firearms brought as evidence must be certified, unloaded, and fitted with visual chamber flags or trigger locks before entering the courtroom. Structural defense. Bullet-resistant materials built into the judicial benches and secure underground transit tunnels specifically for transporting in-custody defendants. So with that big tangent about how courtroom incidents have shaped the way that the courtrooms behave, we are finished with episode 4 of Amazing Stupid Deaths and all of the 1994 submissions. I'm having a lot of fun with these stories, and I hope you are too. Thank you so much for listening, and make sure to subscribe and follow me on Papa Potatis React or Papa Potatis for more gaming material. And don't miss the next episode where we're gonna have some story from 1995, and that drops Wednesday in 2 weeks. Papa Potatis loves you. Take care, little tots. Bye.